welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. Today we are tackling drapes. This is one of those projects that whether you rent or own the space that you're living in, maybe you can't or maybe you don't have the time to paint the walls or put up wallpaper, but you want to really quickly sort of transform the feel of the space. Drapes can do that. So that is what we're going to be tackling. We've been spending most of our time in sort of the servants' quarters kitchen area of this house, and it's a little bit bland looking, and I wanted to do something that could quickly change it without having to do anything too extreme, because the plans that I have for this space are ultimately going to be something a little more involved. So in the meantime, let's figure this out together. I think it's going to come out really amazing. I'm going to start by taking down all of the current existing decorations and the window dressings that were here when we moved in. Gertie understands what a present is for some reason, so every now and again I like to get her something special. So pretty much the first step in this process is going to be staining some lace. Lace used to be used on as a backsplash on curtains all the time. And now a lot of people do sheers, so finding a really pretty lace can be a little bit tricky, and unfortunately it can be pricey unless you live near some sort of a garment district. I have yet to sort of familiarize myself with the area enough to know where to find those places. So in the meantime, I did go to Joann's. I had to go to the wedding department, and it was kind of more expensive than I wanted it to be, but that is an option if you're in a pinch. So the first thing we're going to be doing is taking it from looking like a really beautiful, bright wedding lace and kind of making it look like somebody's been smoking cigars in this house for about 30 years. To create a color-fast coffee-stained effect, I'm mixing a little bit of a brown dye with some sunflower yellow. This should come out right, but I am using a little bit of a paper towel to sort of dip into the solution every now and again, just to make sure the hue is correct. I'm realizing it needs just a touch more color, and I'm even going to put in a splash of black to sort of diminish how vivid the yellow is. And that is exactly the color I wanted. While that's drying out on a line, I'm going to start taking some measurements and designing a pattern. Including these two lace panels that I'm going to be creating, there is going to be a total of 10 pieces per window, which is so many, but it's just going to look so amazing when it's done, so it's worth it in my mind. I have hand sketched out a pattern with all of the specific measurements for these windows. I will be posting that for the $7 and up tier, but there is also enough information in this episode to sort of sort out how to do this, and then you're just going to have to adjust those numbers for your own windows. One of the great things about this particular pattern of lace is if you cut it at the right point, you don't need to sew a hem for the bottom, and you end up with this really pretty looking sort of eyelash fringe. Each window will have 2 panels of lace. The width of each of those panels is going to be 60 inches wide, which is the width of the bolt, and the length is going to be 96 inches long, and that includes a 4-inch allowance at the top. I left an allowance of 4 inches at the top, which I folded over, sewed 2 rows of stitching towards the bottom of that, and that's where the curtain rod will go through, and that way you end up with this really kind of pretty ruffle just above the rod. I'm going to affix this using a 28 to 48 inch spring tension rod. To get them to the right width, you just sort of twist the bar until it's just a little bit too much, and then you squeeze it in between the 2 wood panels on each side. So picking the fabric for your drapes is gonna be a little bit tricky depending on where you're getting them. I wish I knew the names of fabrics. This is some sort of polyester hybrid that's sort of a fake suede. There is a really beautiful drape to it. It's not really prone to wrinkling, and it's very easy to like shape little folds into, as opposed to like a stiff cotton that might be prone to wrinkling and be difficult to shape the way you want it to go. So just sort of be mindful of that, and then also pay attention to when you're making your cuts, making sure all of the fabric is laying in the same direction, because if you take a cut from this piece and a cut from that piece and you lay them up next to each other and they're sort of going in opposite directions, one panel might look darker than the other side. So just sort of be thinking about that as you're going. The blackout drape panels are going to be the longest cuts we're making with our main fabric, and these are essentially the pieces that you will have pulled back and hooked off on the side most of the time. But if you ever really want to darken up the room, you can release them and they should block out virtually all the light. I think I'm discovering that pets are adorable on sewing projects once you've made your cuts, but before then, it gets a little frustrating. I determined the measurements for this cut are going to be 96 inches long by 30 inches wide, and that is including a 4-inch allowance at the top. I didn't actually have a pattern made when I filmed the video, so I sound like I know what I'm talking about at this point, but in the actual video, you're watching me sort of stumble around and figure it out for the first time. The width of this fabric is about 60 inches on the bolt, and because it was so difficult to source and it was also pricey, I had to sort of make do with cutting each one up the middle in half, meaning the width of each panel was going to be 30 inches. In an ideal scenario, it would have been nice if I could have gone a little bit wider and gotten more gathers, but that's kind of what happens when you have a hard time finding the fabric, and when you do, it's expensive. I'm dressing a total of 3 windows in this episode, and each window requires 2 of these panels, so I need to make 6 identical cuts. The quickest way to do that is once you get one cut that is perfect, you lay it down on the other fabric and then just mimic that cut. going to call this next cut a lower window flare, and the reason we're making it is the previous cut we just did, that blackout panel. When you pull that back, it sort of gathers up at the bottom and lifts away from the bottom of the windowsill. If I had an endless amount of this fabric, you could just cut enough that you strung up another panel next to it from the top. But this is a great technique to employ if you want to spare how much of the fabric that you're actually using and still obtain this really kind of gothic over-the-top flare. This cut is going to measure 30 inches wide by 51 inches long from the sharpest point all the way to the top. And this includes a 3-inch allowance at the top that you'll be folding over. You're going to want to make 2 identical panels of this per window. Again, because I'm making these for 3 different windows, I have to make a total of 6 of these cuts. Our next piece is going to be a top side valance, and we're going to be making 2 of these per window, and they should mirror each other. I'm cutting these pieces at a different angle to save fabric on the bolt, and the width of this is going to be 34 inches wide by 56 inches long, and that includes a 4-inch fold-over allowance at the top. Archimedes has very quickly become a very entertaining member of the family, and we love him so much. Our next piece is what I'm calling a top half circle valance. It's my personal favorite, and you're only going to need to make 1 per window. Explaining the measurements on this next cut is a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try. If you look at the essential base cut of this, you're looking at it kind of like it's a pyramid. So look at the bottom of the pyramid, and the width of that is going to be 80 inches. And then from the center of the bottom to the top of the center is going to be about 60 inches, which is the length of this bolt of fabric. And then the flat part at the top of the pyramid is 24 inches wide. And in case that sounds stressful, I should also tell you the way this particular cut sort of folds together, it really doesn't matter if you get it totally perfect, because so long as you get a cut that is generally in this shape, it will sort of drape the way you want it to in the end. And our last cut is going to be what's something I'm calling a top center valance accent. And this is something that's going to go in between the top of the pyramid of that last cut we just did, and you only need to make 1 per window. The essential measurements of this cut is going to be from the center point all the way to the top. You're looking at about 28 inches. And then from those 2 points across from one another towards the bottom is only about 7.5 inches. Before you start your project, you're gonna wanna buy the color of thread that you want. You can buy a whole bunch of these smaller spools. I personally really enjoy buying way larger ones and then transferring them onto smaller spools just because it's so much less expensive. And let's talk about spools. If you ever go to an antique store or an estate sale and you see these old-fashioned ones, buy as many as you can because as you can see compared to a modern one, they hold so much more thread. So you'll only have to do this maybe 1 or 2 times during a project as opposed to using one of these and having to do it probably like, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. Let's also talk about sewing the hems on all of these different cuts that we've created. I don't own a serger. It's one of those things I've always sort of thought of as being for people who sew a ton, and I don't sew enough to justify buying one. So if you are somebody who sews a lot, a serger will make this process go so much faster. But if you are just kind of a hobbyist who's just sort of doing this and don't want to spend a ton of money, you can do all of these hems with a standard sewing machine. And my best tip for you, if you're going to do that, like I'm going to do, is get a whole bunch of your little tiny bobbins filled up with your threads beforehand, because one will be running out and you'll want to be swapping over very quickly. And just sort of doing all of this in one sitting is really going to save you some time. I mentioned I'm dressing 3 separate windows. Each of these windows requires 8 of these green panels. So we're looking at a total of 24 panels, all requiring a hem stitch and then being folded over and sewed. So working at this pace, it took me days to do this. And a serger, I'm sure, would have just blown right through this very quickly, but it is what it is. And luckily, I had some amazing audiobooks I was listening to, and I'll give you my best recommendations. The stories you listen to when you work on projects can really kind of shape how you feel about the project. And I listened to a book called Evil Has a Name, and it was written by Paul Holes and Jim Clemente, and it explains how they caught the Golden State Killer. There are portions that are actually read by victims that survived, and when they catch him at the end, oh my gosh, I was crying tears of happiness. It is easily the best audiobook I've ever listened to. And the last one I'll recommend is called The Phantom Prince, and it's actually written by the girlfriend of Ted Bundy, and while he was committing murders, she was completely unaware. And before I started reading the book, I had kind of a negative opinion of her. And after reading it, it just it gave you a perspective on where she was coming from as far as like just believing in somebody so bad and then ultimately coming to terms with that. So it was a very, very interesting book. And when I wasn't engrossed in an audiobook, I was being entertained by Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Okay, so let's talk about fringe and where to get it. In my old house, I could just go to the garment district, which was like 2 hours away, and you could buy all the fringe you wanted. It was so inexpensive. Here, I'm not familiar with the area enough to know where to go. So I was going to like Joann Fabrics, and I was going to multiple locations to get as much as I needed. And it got horribly expensive. So I know you can buy fringe and tassels and things like that on like Amazon, Etsy, eBay, all of those places. I prefer a garment district just because you can get a large quantity and it's so inexpensive. So once I pulled that Band-Aid off, it was time to start dyeing it. So that is going to be our next step. Before you begin dyeing, it's really helpful to know if you are dealing with synthetic or natural materials, just because they sell dye that's really good for either one of those. But no matter what you're dyeing, you always want to wash anything that you're going to be dyeing really thoroughly with a strong detergent, because they have like residues and things on them from the factory. And you want them to sort of take the color as well as possible. The hotter the solution, the more likely it is that the dye will take to the fabric. So I always boil a bunch of water on the stove and then pour it into the sink to really help the color fastness. Now, this being said, this will work on most of the trims and fabrics that you try to dye in the sink, but occasionally you're going to end up with something sort of odd that just won't take the color. And in that instance, you kind of have to boil your dye and water on the stove and put the trim or fabric directly into that. And if you let it steep for long enough, it'll eventually get to be the color that you want it to. So all of my cuts ultimately needed to be folded over about 4 inches from the top and then pinned. And then I ran 2 lengths of stitching towards that bottom of that hem. And that way you end up with a really pretty gather and the rod goes right in between there. The only piece I did not do this to is the lower window flare, which only needed about a 2-inch fold over because you don't need a little extra gathering on the top of that piece. So because the top half circle valance part is a little bit more complicated, I figured I'd run over this really quickly with you. So if you're looking at it again as a pyramid, the sides of the pyramid you're going to be folding over with about 4 inches of an allowance and doing the same seam that we've been doing on the other ones. And then once you've got that, you can sort of cut off the extra flaps so you end up with something that will lay straight on a curtain rod. To wrap up the top center valance accent, I'm going to be stitching in a wire right behind that center diamond, just so that when this piece lays down, it doesn't ever bend right there, because I'm going to be putting something kind of special right in the center. I'm stitching on some decorative piping to the face to give this piece just a little bit more dimension. Now, to up the fanciness of this project, I'm taking 4 rings of a chain and affixing a crystal to it, and then I'm going to stitch that right into the top of that diamond in the center of this piece. And this way, as you're standing back and you move about the room, when you look up at these curtains, you'll see just a little bit of a glimmer. When attaching your fringe to all of your pieces, you can machine stitch on all of the main portions, but those edges really should be hand stitched to really lock them in. To get the blackout drapes to stay exactly where I wanted them to when I pinned them back, I installed a buttonhole and a button about 23 inches up from the hem. The pink pins signify where the buttonhole will be, and the blue is where the button will go. If my entire career was sewing buttons on, I would be so happy, because for some weird reason, I just totally love doing it. To create the loop on the top of the lower window flare, I sewed over a hem of 2 inches and then using this little grabber McDoodad, pulled through some green piping, and then once that was done, I taped off the edges and then cut it and stitched that together. I'm now taking a wire and I'm going to twist the end into a really tight circle, and I'm going to affix that to the edges of probably about a quarter of the way up on this lower window flare, and I'm going to string it across. And what this is going to do is when you hang it, it's going to keep a spacing in the back that will look really beautiful and almost like Disney-ish from the front. So the way I'm going to be hanging these drapes on the wall is going to be so overly complicated, but you know, I want them to look the way I want. One thing I can give you as far as like a really great tip when you're buying curtain rods, buy one more than you need, because I can't tell you how many times I've lost a screw or misplaced a rubber stopper on one of these and then just felt like the whole project was falling apart on me. So just buy an extra one. They're not terribly expensive. To explain coherently how all of these are going up, let me run down what I'm using for each. I have fixed the lace panels with a spring tension rod. Then I'm using a cafe rod to hang the blackout drapes and a curtain holdback to gather up each side. The lower window flare is being affixed with a simple hook screwed in just below the holdbacks. And the top side valances, top half circle valance, and our top center valance accents are all being hung using one set of double curtain rods. I'm in love with this online retailer I found called Nearly Natural, and they sell these really great fake plants for people who just absolutely can't remember to water living things. So one of the reasons I like them is because when you look at old vintage pictures of Victorian homes, you always see sort of palm fronds and ferns gently smattered about the room. I mentioned in the last stream that I found these glass plate negatives in a drawer of the house, and these are actually the original lady and gentleman of the house, Thomas Richardson and Harriet Richardson, reclining in the solarium with their favorite dogs. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm beyond thrilled with how these drapes came out. They look like something from a Vincent Price House of Usher kind of movie. So obviously I love them. Enjoy yourselves this month. It's such a beautiful time of year. I will be posting another episode before the end of the month, so look out for that, and I will see you very soon.